My name is Marion Whitaker, and I am 68 years old. The day we lowered my husband into the ground was the quietest my heart has ever been, the kind of silence that isn't peace but a pressure like snow on a roof. You can feel from inside the house. At the cemetery in Dayton, the wind hushed the trees to a standstill. I kept my hands clasped at my waist to hide the tremor and fixed my stare on the casket's brass handle so I wouldn't have to look at the faces around it. When my purse buzzed against my hip, I refused to move. Phones don't belong at the edge of a grave, I thought. But it vibrated again, insistent, and I could feel it shape through the fabric, the way you sense a word you'd rather not hear. The pastor's voice blurred into a shapeless murmur. I finally slid the phone out and cupped it low, half hidden behind the fold of my black coat. A message from an unknown number waited on the screen. Not an accident. Do not trust the boys. Check MERIDIAN Bank. The world tilted a few degrees, as if the cemetery were suddenly built on a slope. I hooked a hand on the back of the folding chair to steady myself. Beside the grave, my oldest Greg wore the correct solemn expression, the one he uses when he wants a judge or a loan officer to believe him. My younger son Lucas stood with his jaw set and his eyelids lowered as if he had rehearsed looking grieved and only needed to keep time with the speech. Greg checked his watch once. Lucas blinked too slowly, like a metronome dragging one beat behind. "You are being cruel," I told whatever name hid behind the number. "You are being cruel to say it wasn't an accident." I slid the phone face down into the purse and held the strap like a lifeline. The pastor spoke of ashes and comfort and reunions. Comfort felt like a room without doors. Reunion felt like a place I had once known and could no longer find. When Mrs. Jansen, our neighbor from 2 streets over, touched my elbow and whispered Marion, it was the first time I registered my own name since morning. We had built a simple life, Harold and I. He tuned and repaired pianos out of the garage, coaxing reluctant notes back into tune while the radio hummed low. I kept books for a little thrift store on Linden Avenue, counting quarters and reconciling spreadsheets that never needed more than 1,000 rows. We saved what we could re-season pots. Instead of replacing them, used the same chipped blue mugs for 20 years. We taught the boys to keep promises and wash their own dishes, and I used to think that would be enough. Somewhere along the line, the language in our house changed. Deals replaced chores. Leverage replaced help. Greg learned the taste of risk and called it grit. Lucas learned to nod while someone else decided. They both learned how money claps for you if you let it, and once they heard it, our little porch conversations sounded to them like background noise. I told myself it was ambition, and ambition was a coat you could wear without asking whose winter you were in. The funeral was smaller than it should have been. No one from the piano stores Harold visited with his tuning kit. None of the choir directors who used to wave him into the rehearsal halls. Greg had handled the arrangements and said Dad liked things simple, Mom. Harold did like simple but never meager. Meager leaves room for secrets to sit down at the table. When the service ended, the lines of people briefly formed and then dissolved like a shoal of fish turned by an unseen shift in current. Mrs. Jansen insisted on driving me home. I set the purse in my lap and pressed it into my ribs hard enough to feel the corners of the phone. The unknown number glowed in my mind like a coal. Not an accident. Do not trust the boys. Check MERIDIAN Bank. If it wasn't an accident. What was it? And if it was who wanted to make me doubt my own eyes, my own days? The house felt colder than the cemetery. I hung my black coat on the hook by the door and watched it sag there heavy and without a body. Harold's chair by the front window was empty, the cushion dented where he used to lean forward to listen. The tools he kept for delicate work, key-leveling blocks, a little vial of graphite felt punchings in a labeled tin, were arranged on the bench like a paused conversation. I poured water into the kettle, then let it steam away untasted. People think grief is a flood. Sometimes it's a drought. The kettle complained, then quieted, and the silence reached for my throat again. The message waited where I'd left it. I turned the phone over and typed back with clumsy thumbs, "Who is this?" A reply snapped into place almost at once. "Can't say. They are watching. Don't sign anything." My name didn't appear in the text. Neither did Harold's. Still, it knew there were documents. It knew there were watchers. I stared at the words until my eyes burned and the letters started to wobble on the screen. 6 months earlier, Greg had arrived with a folder and a confidence that took up too much air. "Dad," he said, all smiles and forethought, "it's time to plan like professionals. A life policy isn't about death, it's about security." Lucas, obliging shadow that he can be had, echoed, "It's just smart, Mom." They had sprawled papers across the kitchen table and talked about riders and premiums and maximizing vehicles as if we were choosing a vacation package. Harold, who could take apart a damped action with his eyes closed, stared at the columns of numbers as if they were written in an alphabet he'd never learned. He signed after weeks of persuasion. I smoothed the pages and filed my worry under the label I use when I want to believe they only want what's best. After that, the boys' visits grew shorter and the value of their cars grew longer. They began to talk in calendars, closing dates, investment, windows, quarters. Every time they sat on our porch under the string of bulbs Harold had hung from the eaves, I felt like I had wandered into a meeting for which I had not received the agenda. When I objected to selling the house, Greg spread his hands and said, "Mom, this place is sentimentally priceless and practically obsolete." Lucas added, "Or let us manage it." You taught us responsibility. Their wives had joined once, Sloane with perfume that made the whole room look polished, and Nadia with an impatient sigh whenever I paused before an answer. They listed retirement communities as if I were a brochure. Harold squeezed my fingers under the table that night, the pressure full of apology and warning. I carried my purse down the hall after the funeral, past the photographs in their thrift store frames, past the little square where we used to mark the boys' heights on their birthdays. In the small room that had always smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper, I unlocked Harold's desk. The top drawer slid open with the reluctance of something that has not moved in a while. Receipts, old bank slips, a tune-up invoice for Mr. Redmond's spinet from March. Beneath them all, a manila folder with a metal clasp. Inside lay the insurance documents Greg had presented months earlier. Only now there were more amendments, changes, additional coverage. I had not heard spoken aloud in my kitchen. The dates on the forms ran like a string of beads, each one closer to the present. Folded between two pages was a narrow scrap torn from a yellow pad. The handwriting was Harold's, square, unhurried, especially when he wanted me to find it. He had written only a line. Greg insists again, says it's for Marion. I'm not sure. I sat down on the ottoman because my knees had become strangers to me. The scrap of paper stung like a nettle in the palm. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't even a confession. It was a man accustomed to weighing a note with a wrench rather than with words setting down the bare minimum I hear pressure. I doubt its tune. The phone vibrated once more on my lap. The screen lit the ceiling in a pale wave. I didn't pick it up right away. I looked at the folder spread open at my name in boxes I had not initialed at the premiums that had doubled, and then crept again higher at Harold's checkmarks next to lines he would have asked me about if he felt free to do so. Did he ask, and silence come back to him? I closed the folder and opened it again as if repetition would make the pages answer. In my head, I could hear the sounds of our house from before the kettle's thrum, Harold's fault-finding hum as he coaxed a note. True, the old clock 2 rooms over. A house is half memory. The rest is paperwork. By the time I lifted the phone, the message had already landed. Look at withdrawals, look at signatures. I turned to the box where we kept letters the bank sent every December. Harold and I had saved decades of them in rubber-banded bundles, statements, and brochures we never read twice. I pulled down the most recent stack and fanned them onto the desk. The numbers did not sing to me. They scattered. I am not a detective. I am a woman trying to make a ledger explain a heartbeat. Still, certain figures stood out like potholes in a neatly paved street, 1,000 here, 3,000 there. Monthly. Regular enough to have a rhythm. I traced my finger against a photocopied slip and felt the stutter of the pen where the line of Harold's name wavered. He controlled his letters even when he was tired. He would rather write slowly than carelessly. This was not slow, it was unsure. I laid the slip down and pressed the heel of my hand to my sternum. The unknown number Meridian Bank withdrawal signatures that looked like my husband's from a distance, and like a stranger's if you leaned close. Harold, I said aloud to the chair, to the emptied mug on the sill, to the notch in the doorframe where he once bumped the leg of a piano. He regretted moving alone. What did they bring you? That you did not want? What did they call it to make it sound like help? The house answered this way houses do in the creak of wood that cools at night in the sigh of heat, settling in its vents in silence. I put the phone, the scrap of paper, and the folder on the desk in a small, deliberate stack. My hands had stopped shaking. There are moments when doubt is a fog, and moments when it falls into shape like a column you can measure. I did not know who had sent the messages. I did not know exactly what I was seeing, but I knew that the thing we had been promised security had a shadow behind it, and the shadow had a name I was not ready to speak aloud. I locked the desk and set the key under the terracotta bird Harold had bought me at the flea market the spring before last. Then I sat in his chair and watched the light crawl along the floor until it found the hem of my dress. "Harold," I said again softly this time, "I'm listening." Morning thinned the darkness into a pale wash against the living room sheers, and I found myself exactly where I had ended the night Harold's desk, the manila folder open like a wound. The scrap in his handwriting lay on top. I set a saucer over it as if a small porcelain weight could keep a sentence from drifting away. I dressed without noticing colors, choosing a cardigan from the back of a chair and shoes that didn't squeak. The kettle breathed itself to a whistle. I shut it off. I didn't want the steadiness of tea. Steadiness felt dishonest. On the counter, the house key waited where I always left it, a nickel oval on the corner tile chipped long ago by a dropped plate. I took the folder, the phone, and a calm I did not trust, and drove to Meridian Bank's downtown branch, the one with lion heads carved into limestone above the doors. The lobby floor had been buffed to a shine that made me think of ice. A wreath hung over the teller line, left over winter without the cold. Mrs. Whitaker, the manager, said when I gave my name. Her badge read A. Patel in neat block letters. She was the kind of woman who keeps tissues in a drawer before you know you'll ask. "I'm very sorry about Harold." "Thank you," I said, and the words felt like shapes my mouth remembered, but my heart didn't. "I need to review all our accounts, not balances, records, withdrawals, slips with signatures. I'll need to see them." She gestured me into a glass-walled office where the world outside blurred into a polite aquarium. The computer hummed. Her fingers moved carefully with an accountant's reverence. When columns populated the screen, I didn't lean forward. Distance felt safer. The numbers arranged themselves in neat gray type. January, February, March. Each month a clean word above rows that did not feel clean at all. $1,000 came out in winter. $3,000 in the month that felt like mud. $4,000 when the tulips were up. Regular round sums as if chosen for how easily they sit in a mouth. "That can't be right," I said softly, pointing. "We don't spend like that." "We keep images of slips for anything done in person," Ms. Patel said. "You can review them." She printed copies, the paper warm, each page whispering when it slid into the tray. I held the first in both hands. There was Harold's name, a loop I had watched him make 1,000 times across checks and birthday cards, only here the line wavered not in the way of age, but as if someone were trying to trace a song they didn't know. The second slip was the same. The third had the stutter of a pen lifted and set down too soon. "Did he come alone?" I asked. Her gaze moved to the lower corner of the screen where small notes lived. "It indicates he was accompanied at least twice." The teller added adult son present and an initial I believe is G. "Greg." I said his name to myself without letting it out into the room. The letters tasted like a seed husk. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said, and my voice recommended itself as a person who has never made trouble at a bank. "But I need copies of everything. If there's footage, if there was a camera." "We don't release footage without a request from law enforcement," she said, and her eyes softened, which did not make me feel smaller so much as more real to her. "I can prepare records and a summary." "Thank you," I said. "One more question. Did anyone raise concerns about his signature? Harold was deliberate." She hesitated. "There's a note in March," teller penned, "customer having difficulty reading line items. Son states father's eyes are tired, offers to assist. It isn't unusual for family to help, but your husband always read every line when he came alone." I signed the request forms without remembering the shapes my own hand made. Miss Patel walked me to the door with a printed envelope and an expression I recognized from the thrift store when we kept a sweater aside for someone whose budget liked them less than their shoulders did, pity dressed as professionalism. On the sidewalk, cold air stung the inside of my nose. The lion heads glared beyond me at nothing in particular. I sat in the car and placed the envelope on my lap as if it had weight, which it did. My phone vibrated gently against my coat lining. How much came out, the unknown number asked. "Regular amounts, monthly, slip signed." Not how he signs, I wrote, thumb steady. A minute bloomed and fell away. Policy push came from them. Money covered debts. Don't drink anything they bring. The words settled in the car like another person. I looked at my face in the mirror, a woman in a cardigan she hadn't chosen and a mouth that had learned a new line overnight. I drove to the Dayton Police Department because there are places where truth has to pass through a doorway before it changes shape. The building had bricks the color of old pennies and a pragmatism I wanted to borrow. The receptionist sent me down a short hall to Sergeant R. Nolan, who stood when I stepped in. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, in a voice that knew better than to reach for my arm. "I'm sorry about Harold. What can I do?" "I need the report from the explosion at his workshop," I said. "The one at the garage. The hospital called me. They said he was burned. Head injury." He slid into his chair and turned to the computer, the screen's light rising like a small moon onto his face. He typed with the quiet efficiency of someone who knows where to look. After a minute, the lines around his eyes altered. "There's no report of an explosion at your address," he said. "I'm checking back 30 days. 60. 90. Nothing." I listened for the sound my heart would make when it split. It made no such sound. It continued stubborn as habit. "That's not possible," I said. He was admitted. There was a call. Someone said, "I'm looking at the hospital intake notes," he said, opening another window and reading until the words arranged themselves into something he could say aloud. "Admission indicates altered mental status. Visual disturbance, metabolic acidosis. Toxicology panel shows methanol. It says suspected ingestion." Methanol, I repeated because a word you can say might be a word you can survive. "It's found in solvents, fuel, sometimes in denatured alcohol," he added, voice careful. It metabolizes into formaldehyde and formic acid. It can look like other things. He stopped. A person with the good sense to stop. Why didn't anyone tell me? My hands had threaded themselves together as if sewing a seam you can't see. I signed nothing. I'm his next of kin. He glanced down at the file. There's a confidentiality directive signed by Gregory Whitaker listed as healthcare proxy. It cites fragility following bereavement and requests limited disclosure. Bereavement, I said, and the word walked into the room wearing the wrong face. He wasn't dead yet. Sergeant Nolan didn't wince exactly, but his mouth tightened into a line that meant this is bad in a language police use with their eyes. He clicked a few more boxes. We can request full records. If there's suspicion, we can request a tox workup from the lab and get chain of custody confirmation. I'll need you to provide any documents you have financial insurance. I opened the envelope from Meridian and set it on his desk, the paper lifting the faintest smell of ink. I added Harold's note, the insurance copies, the printouts Ms. Patel had given me. He didn't pick them up right away. He looked at me first. Are you safe at home? He asked. Yes, I said, because I was seated in a police building, and because the truth is sometimes little and sometimes big, and this time I believe the little one would get me to the big one. When I stepped into the afternoon, the sky had brightened into the kind of thin blue that can't keep secrets. My phone buzzed again as if it had been waiting for the exact moment my shoes touched the sidewalk. 3:00 p.m., Penny and Pine, back table, ask for Colin, show him this. A second message followed with a photo, a business card, Colin Reyes, licensed investigator, and a date stamp from 3 weeks before Harold died. The corners of the card were creased from a pocket that had done other work. A person can live with suspicion the way a person can live with a pebble in their shoe, awkwardly, angrily, endlessly. I did not want a pebble. I wanted the exact shape of what I was stepping on. Penny and Pine was a corner cafe with tin ceiling tiles painted the color of cream and a chalkboard menu written by someone who enjoyed loops and flourishes. The bell over the door chimed as I entered. I chose a table where I could see the street and not be seen from it easily, my phone face down, my hands open. At the dot of 3, a man with a salt and pepper beard and a coat he could have owned for 10 winters stopped near my chair. Mrs. Whitaker, he asked quietly. Yes. He slid into the seat across us, setting a worn leather folder between us. He tapped his breast pocket and then the folder, a gesture like a habit. I'm Colin Reyes. This is my license. He let me read it. Harold contacted me 3 weeks before he was admitted to the hospital. I'm sorry to meet you this way. What did my husband ask you to do? He said something didn't fit. He didn't like the pressure about an insurance policy he didn't fully understand. He said your sons were in and out with papers. He said questions had changed shape. He wanted a record of what was being presented to him, of conversations he wasn't sure how to remember when he was alone. And you, what did you record? He opened the folder and laid a small digital recorder on the table like a bird you might release if you were certain it could fly. He pressed play. Harold's voice rose hesitant and plain. If you're hearing this, Colin, it means I went through with the test. Greg says the policy is to protect Marion. Lucas brings the papers, but he looks at Greg before he speaks. They asked me this morning what time I take my coffee and whether Marion drinks hers at the same time. That sounded like a sideways question. I told them I'd think about the new writer. My hand shook when I signed the last thing. That's not me. The cafe noise dimmed to a low cloth hush. I closed my eyes because faces are too much when a voice you love is being brave in a room without you. Colin cued another file. Voices this time, not Harold's. Greg first clipped and efficient. It has to happen before end of quarter. He's starting to balk. We'll never get the valuation if he gets nosy. Lucas thinner, adhesively agreeable. Then we do it. Stop talking about it and do it. Greg again. Denatured will look like a bottle for the shop. He drinks light roast because of his stomach. A splash isn't a splash if you use the right ratio. He won't taste it. Lucas and Mom. A scrape of a chair in the recording. Colin must have adjusted something near event. Greg. She'll fold. She always folds after the event. We say it's grief, or we don't have to say anything if she signs. Either way, the house goes and the policy pays. The file ended. The tiny screen clicked back to the seconds display. I put my finger on the table to keep from putting it on Colin's recorder as if to stop a thing that had already happened. I have more, he said softly. Photos. Greg at a developer's office in Cincinnati. A ledger a contractor sent me after a dispute, $72,000 owed past due. Lucas visiting a storefront I traced to an illegal sports book. A hardware receipt for denatured alcohol charged to Greg's business card. He told the clerk it was for strip cleaning a finish. I can't prove intent with a receipt, but taken together, you have enough to explain what my body already knows, I said. He nodded once, a spare nod, the kind a man uses when words no longer add much. He slid printouts across Greg under fluorescent lighting at a glass table, a document with a header I didn't understand. Lucas with a man in a puffy jacket, both too careful with their faces. A photo of my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. Greg and Lucas walking Harold to the car, their hands under his elbows, too helpful, too symmetrical. "Harold asked me to give you this if anything happened," Colin said, and unfolded a single page, handwritten in Harold's blocky hand. "Marian, if I'm not sitting across from you when you read this, you know why I asked for help. I didn't want to make you worry with guesses. I wanted proof. If I misjudged, forgive me. If I did not, you will need more than one pair of hands." I pressed the heel of my palm against my sternum again, not to keep myself from breaking, but to hold something steady while the room tilted back into place. "Who sent the texts?" I asked. Colin didn't look away. "I did. From a line that can't be traced to my personal accounts. I didn't want to show up at your door without warning, and I couldn't be sure your phone wasn't being monitored. When he hired me, Harold said Greg had started forwarding your mail and proposing to streamline bills. I thought, caution. It was the right choice, I said, because I needed to hand someone a right choice to balance the wrong ones. The police have the hospital note and the withdrawals. They'll ask for more. I've already spoken with Sergeant Nolan, Colin said. I'll hand him copies of the recordings and a sworn statement about chain of custody where the devices were, who touched them. Everything that lets them hold up in court. I'll also document the dates and locations of the photos. He paused, his gaze steady but not hard. Don't eat or drink anything they offer. Don't sign. If they come, you call me before you open the door. I nodded, and the motion felt like setting a metronome, a beat to move by when music threatens to run. On the way out, I ordered a coffee and left it on the counter, untouched, a prop set down between scenes. On the sidewalk, the late sun had a brittle edge. I walked a block before realizing I still had the recorder in my coat pocket. I turned back, and Colin was standing where I had left him, as if he knew I'd return. I handed it to him, and we didn't bother with comments about forgetfulness. He lifted a finger in a small salute, and I mirrored it before hurrying away. At home, the house took me in without condition. I set the envelope from MERIDIAN on the table, then Colin's printouts beside it, then Harold's note at the top like a title for a folder that did not yet have a name. I picked up the phone to call Sergeant Nolan, and he answered on the second ring. I have additional materials, I said. Recordings, photos, a letter. I won't discuss them over the phone. Bring them, he said. I'll log them as evidence. We'll contact the county attorney. We'll request a medical examiner's review. If you're comfortable, we'll take a formal statement from you today. I said yes. I put on Harold's old field jacket, a canvas thing with paint flecks on a cuff from a room we painted that summer. We tried blue and went back to cream, and tucked the folder under my arm. I locked the door with a hand that did not tremble. The department smelled of coffee without sweetness and floor cleaner that had recently lost a battle. I signed where they told me to read the oath aloud and answered questions until the shape of truth felt less like a cliff and more like a field with posts marking the edges. When we finished, Sergeant Nolan slid the recorder into an evidence bag, sealed it, wrote the date and his initials. He looked at me for a long second, not to measure whether I would fall apart, but as if to locate where I was standing in a landscape he had seen too often. We'll move this forward, he said. If anything occurs, any contact, any pressure, call immediately. By the time I stepped back outside, evening had moved the light down into the spaces between buildings. I drove home past the thrift shop, now dark, the window dressed with a mannequin in a coat someone had loved before and would love again. The porch bulbs Harold had strung cast small coins of yellow against the siding. I stood on the top step and watched a moth orbit the nearest one, persistent as if it had a single instruction and believed in it. Inside, I set the deadbolt, then the chain. I drew the curtains to just before the sill. On the kitchen table, the stacks of paper sat like a chorus, with their mouths closed. I turned on the lamp. Harold favored a bronze base shaped like a vine winding around itself, and the room settled into the kind of light he liked for repairing delicate parts. I pulled a legal pad toward me and wrote 3 lines I didn't want to forget, not for poetry and not for law, just for the way ink anchors a thought that would otherwise float. Meridian slips hand unsteady. Hospital intake methanol. Colin's recording's voice is clear. Then I set the pen aside and pressed a hand flat over the page as if heat from my palm could dry something still wet. The radiator ticked. Somewhere a car door closed and then opened again. The neighborhood carried on. People dropped forks into sinks. A dog barked at a late walker. A TV lifted laughter too bright to be real. I sat in Harold's chair and watched a thin crack of light where the curtain hem didn't quite meet. A figure moved along the sidewalk beyond the hedge gray coat, then gone. The clock in the other room counted 8, 9, 10 with a seriousness disproportionate to numbers. I breathed until breath felt like its own kind of work. In the desk drawer under the stapler, I found a photograph I hadn't seen in years. Harold standing in the garage with his hand on the spine of an upright dust in his hair like flour. A grin that reached the corner of his eyes. I set it beside the folder and left the lamp on. The house didn't ask me anything. It kept its end of the agreement. It would hold what I brought into it. When the phone buzzed again, I didn't startle. I picked it up ready for anything that used words. The phone on the table quivered once a small insect of light. I filed with Nolan. Keep the chain on. If they arrive, text me one word here. CR. I typed the word into the draft bar and left it unsent. The house held its breath with me. The knock came at 8:17. A polite rhythm too careful to be neighborly. Through the pane beside the door, I saw the black SUV idling at the curb, and behind it a silver sedan with a scab of road salt on the bumper. Greg's coat was dark wool. Lucas had chosen a jacket that made him look like a boy in a man's photograph. Greg carried a white paper bag stamped with La Viennoise in gold script. Lucas lifted a stainless thermos like an offering. I slipped the chain to its shortest link and opened the door to the width of my palm. Morning, Greg said, pitching his voice into the deep register he uses when he wants a clerk to waive a fee. We brought your favorite almond croissants from that place you like, and house blend from the corner shop, Lucas added too brightly. They ground it fresh. The draft text sat open under my thumb. I felt the pulse in my wrist and pressed send. Thank you, I said, and let the chain scrape one bead wider. I already made tea. Greg's smile had edges. You shouldn't be alone today, Mom. May we come in? I widened the door and stepped back, positioning myself so I could see the hall and the back window in the same line. The bag released a sweet, buttery perfume that should have belonged to another morning. Lucas set the thermos on the counter and unscrewed the cap with a flourish, as if he were helpful in a way that could be photographed. You'll love these, Greg said, sliding a white bakery box from the bag. Almond. Your favorite, right? He was already reaching for plates. We also brought a few forms, simple things your doctor will want signed, and a placement reservation at Maple Ridge. It's temporary, so you can rest without the burden of this place. This place, I repeated. The words felt like dropped change. And what happens to the house while I rest? Greg glanced at Lucas, whose yes face came on like a light. We'd manage it, Greg said smoothly. Market's softening. Best to list sooner. We've got a line on a cash buyer who doesn't quibble about inspection, which honestly is a blessing given the age of the wiring. Lucas set out 3 mugs and poured from the thermos. The coffee steamed dark and friendly as a lie told with both hands. Cream or no, he asked. No, I said, and reached for the kettle to make the motion of tending to it, though it was dry. My stomach's unsettled. Greg unfolded a neat stack of papers and presented the top page, with a pen balanced just so. I recognized the grammar of control, the form names wearing benign clothes. Health information release, placement consent, property management, authorization, insurance beneficiary update. He tapped a yellow flag where he wanted my initials, then another where he wanted my full name. I'd like to read them, I said, and didn't lift my hands. All of them. Of course, Greg said, settling at the table as if he had planned to spend the day and didn't mind. Time is a kindness. We can go page by page. Lucas pushed a mug toward me until its warmth nudged my knuckle. I moved it back an inch with one finger. He laughed without opening his mouth. Strong stuff, he said. Cures everything. My phone face down near the lamp flashed once and went mute. A message from no one to no one. I let the silence stand up between us and become a fourth person in the room. Greg began his tour. This first is HIPAA, so we can coordinate with your physician. Then there's the Maple Ridge intake. They've got an opening next week. The management authorization just allows us to handle utilities and routine maintenance, and the insurance update is housekeeping. The agent recommended consolidating, cleaner for taxes. Set the croissants on the counter, I said. I'll fix a plate if I decide to eat. My voice didn't shake. It felt borrowed from a woman who'd been a notary once. He obliged. The pastries sat in their white box like petals in an altar arrangement. Lucas sipped his coffee and watched me over the rim as if my face were a ledger. I'll read in the living room, I said, for the chair, for the lamp, for distance. I carried the stack across the threshold and sat, where Harold used to listen for the faintest buzz in a string. Greg followed with a pen poised over certainty. Lucas hovered near the doorway. Hands in his pockets, the picture of harmlessness he's practiced since he discovered that people dislike asking a smiling man to leave. Smiling. The first page called itself Authorization with a date already filled in. The second was a limited power of attorney, narrow and tricky, stitched with phrases like, for the purpose of, and limited to, but not excluding. The third was an exclusive listing agreement printed with a commission percentage that had skipped honest and gone straight to greedy. The fourth, new to me, invoked a change in contingent beneficiary, boxed and bolded. Who added this? I asked, touching the beneficiary form without touching it. We discussed nothing about beneficiaries. Just cleanup, Greg said. Your name stays. The trust structure downstream is more efficient. It reduces probate friction. Lucas rocked once on his heels. It's what Dad would have wanted. I looked up at him. What Dad wanted was to read every line. Greg's pen made a dot on the air, then settled. Mom, grief fogs things. We're trying to prevent you from being taken advantage of. I'm not fogged. Then read, he said, and leaned back magnanimous as if he had granted me literacy and time. I read, I let the minutes stretch long enough to become noticeable. Twice I asked for water and carried my own glass from the sink. The thermos sat in its small vapor like a thing performing itself. Lucas wandered to the window and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. Outside the block wore its ordinary face, Mr. Dalrymple moving his trash bin, a jogger in a neon cap passing with more breath than I had. The second time I lifted my glass, my phone buzzed once in my pocket, this time a different pocket than before. I palmed it and glanced. Unit at end of block. Hold them, N. I capped the pen though it hadn't written and laid it flat. What happens to the tuning kit? I asked suddenly. Harold's tools. They're not worth much to anyone else, but they're worth something to me. Storage, Greg said. We'll box them and arrange climate control. Lucas can coordinate. Right, Luke. Sure, Lucas said, but his eyes had shifted to the hall, counting doorways, the way a person counts escape routes in a movie he doesn't believe is fiction. The doorbell rang, a bright domestic sound that has announced pies and packages and an aunt bearing too much lipstick. Greg's forehead tightened. Expecting someone, he asked lightly. Yes, I said, and stood smoothing the edge of the papers as if this were still a morning with forms and pastries and ordinary pledges. Please stay here. Stay. I walked to the door and checked the chain. Through the glass, I saw a man and a woman in plain clothes and winter coats. Behind them, farther down, a dark sedan nuzzled the curb. When I opened to the width of my palm, the woman lifted a badge case. Mrs. Whitaker, she said, voice level. Detective Lang, is Gregory Whitaker present? Is Lucas Whitaker present? They are. May we come in? I slipped the chain, yes. Greg rose as they entered, training his face into charm seasoned with offense. Is there a problem, officers? Detective Lang corrected gently. We have a few questions. You can answer here or at the station. Lucas set his cup down too fast. The ceramic clicked against the saucer and left a ring like a target. His jaw moved as if cutting thread with his teeth. We're just helping our mother, Greg said, gesturing to the papers with a flourish designed for juries that haven't been seated yet. She's not well. I'm well, I said. Detective Lang's partner, compact quiet, stepped toward the counter and sniffed once. He flipped the lid from the thermos as if he were opening a book he already knew by heart. You bring this? He asked without looking up. For hospitality, Lucas said. Is that a crime now? Not a crime to bring coffee, the partner said mildly, screwing the cap back on. Though a hospitality that insists is rarely kind. Let's not, Greg said, his smile stretching thin. Mom, tell them we're here to help with paperwork. They're here to ask you questions, I said, and took the stack from the table with both hands, as if it were laundry I meant to protect from weather. Detective Lang nodded once to me in acknowledgement, as small and sufficient as a breath. Mr. Whitaker, she said to Greg, do you have identification on you? In my car, he said, and then too quickly I can step out and get it. We'll accompany you, she said, to Lucas and you. Wallet, he said, patting his pocket, then his other, performing an innocence he wore thin. The partner spoke into his shoulder mic, low, routine syllables that turned the room into a place with edges. I watched Greg calculate and then choose a shape for himself, a cooperative citizen in a story he planned to narrate. He lifted his coat from the chair back. Mom, he said smoothly, we'll be right outside. Take your time, I said. On the porch, the winter light shaved everything to clean lines. The detectives moved with practiced courtesy, one ahead, one behind. The street that had been ordinary made room for 2 unmarked cars I could not have named yesterday and could describe blindfolded now. When Greg reached the SUV and touched the handle, 2 more figures stepped from the gray sedan down the block. The air tightened without getting colder. Gregory Whitaker, one called. Yes, please keep your hands where we can see them. He laughed, astonished, rehearsed, and spread his fingers like a man in a seminar about body language. Is this really necessary? Necessary, the detective repeated, and the word clipped itself short. Lucas had hung back by the azalea, his shoulders heaping under his jacket as if shrinking could outrun sight. He took 1 step toward the sidewalk and found another plain car there where one had not been a moment before. He swallowed and tried on a grin so weak it barely fit. Detective Lang glanced at me. Ma'am, would you prefer to step inside? I'll stand here, I said, and braced my hand on the rail where Harold had once leaned to watch thunder come in from the west. The next minutes made a shape I could trace later. Greg's voice rising, then flattening, the sound of a door opening and shutting that was not mine, Lucas answering and answering again, the low cadence of rights spoken without hurry. A neighbor's curtain twitched. The moths that had loved our porch bulbs in summer had left for their own reasons. When the sedans pulled away, no sirens. Only the quiet gravity of official movement, the air eased half an inch. I realized I had been standing with my shoulders lifted and let them fall. Detective Lang and her partner returned to the threshold. We've detained them for questioning, she said evenly. We'll be in touch. Do you need the papers they brought? We'll retrieve them from evidence, she said, and then almost gently lock your door. I did. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a paragraph closing. The coffee sat where Lucas had left it, cooling into a smell that lost its sweetness first, and then its certainty. I carried the thermos to the sink and set it down without emptying it. The croissants went into the trash without ceremony. On the table, the pen lay where Greg had staged it, angled patient, expecting to be useful. I returned it to the drawer and wiped the table with a damp cloth, my mother's motion small and ordinary. The cloth was clean, but the habit steadied my hands. I stacked the papers and slid them into the manila folder with the others. Harold's note, I am not sure, remained at the top, a sentence that fit all the days before and none of the ones after. Evening took the room in increments. I switched on the lamp with the bronze vine and stood in its pool of light, listening for the house to tell me if anything had come loose in the rafters. It told me only what it always tells: where the floor dips and where it doesn't, which board will creak, how much a curtain moves when the vent opens. I sat in Harold's chair and put my feet flat on the rug and let the quiet place its hands on my shoulders, not heavy, not soft, simply there. Night softened into a thin blue morning and held. The thermos still sat by the sink like an unplayed note. I washed the cups, dried them, and set them upside down. At 9, the phone rang with a voice that had learned my rooms. Mrs. Whitaker, Sergeant Nolan said, we've transferred both men to county. The county attorney will proceed on charges that include homicide and attempted poisoning. We'll need you at the courthouse this afternoon for a preliminary appearance. The line clicked quiet after I agreed. I stood a moment with the towel in my hands and without meaning to smoothed its edge against the counter until the fabric remembered being straight. The courthouse smelled faintly of pencil shavings and old heat. Colin waited near the elevator, hat in his hands, the brim rolling once between his fingers before he stopped it. I brought chain of custody affidavits, he said. They'll want those early. In the small courtroom, benches filled with a slow hush. Ms. Patel sat 2 rows behind me, a folder against her knees. When Greg and Lucas were let in, Greg's mouth was set to neutral, the expression he uses when a deal is not going his way, but he expects to steer it back. Lucas looked younger than he is, his eyes moving in quick, thin steps. The judge called names, the clerk read charges. The words stood up on their own count. 1, murder in the first degree. Count 2, attempted murder. Count 3, conspiracy. When the prosecutor summarized the basis for probable cause, she spoke in the grammar of facts: a toxicology report listing methanol, bank withdrawals with inconsistent signatures, recordings recovered from a licensed investigator, a receipt for denatured alcohol purchased 2 days before Harold's admission, a healthcare proxy filed without my signature on any supporting document. Greg's attorney stood and did what attorneys do, slice the moment into doubt. He said grief distorts memory. He said the recordings were out of context. He said a receipt is not a motive. Lucas's attorney called his client a follower, not a planner, a boy half caught in the wind of a stronger personality. The judge scheduled the next hearing. Cuffs clicked, chains moved without hurry. The trial came with its own weather. On the first day, the county hung no food or drink, signs closer to the doors than usual, and the bailiff's voice grew a notch firmer when he asked us to silence devices. Ms. Patel testified first. Her careful hands turned documents without noise while she explained how the bank keeps images of slips and notations. Mr. Whitaker always read line items when alone, she said. The difference was notable. The medical examiner followed a woman with gray hair braided into a crown that made her look like she could sew and argue and mourn in a single afternoon. She explained methanol in terms a jury could keep in both hands, how it metabolizes, how formate salts settle in blood, how optic discs pale, how an alcohol that isn't meant for drinking can be poured into a bottle, that is. She didn't raise her voice. She let the chemistry hold its own. Colin took the stand with the recorder. The judge permitted the files after a hearing on authentication. He spoke about dates, about devices that were never left unattended, about where he had stood to capture the voices on a Tuesday near a back-loading dock while a vent fan covered the sound of his breathing. The room went meat quiet when Harold's voice played steady and uncertain at once. I watched 3 jurors look away, not from offense, but in the small politeness of not staring at a widow, while her husband speaks from a place that has no microphone. When the file cut to Greg, the jury looked back. It has to happen before end of quarter, he said, his cadence clipped and efficient. On another recording, Lucas asked, and Mom and Greg answered as if planning a delivery window. Cross-examination tried to knot the simple things until they looked like elaborate chords. Greg's attorney asked about editing software and whether a clip could be juxtaposed. He suggested that Ms. Patel misremembered how often Harold came alone. He asked the medical examiner if ethanol could mimic methanol if a test were misrun. Each time the answers held. The recorder's simple plastic shell did not ask to be believed. It just sat there. When it was my turn, I walked to the box and rested my hand on a Bible that looked like it had a job outside of ceremony. I told the story the way breath will short where it couldn't stretch longer where it had to. I said what the messages read. I said what my sons brought to my kitchen and how they placed it on the counter. I said I didn't drink the coffee. I said I wanted to read the forms. I said forms like a word that had learned to defend itself. Greg kept his eyes on a point near the courtroom clock. Lucas looked at his hands the way a child looks at a scraped knee, acknowledging the hurt without deciding whether to cry. The defense called a character witness from Greg's office who used the phrase high-performing as if it could absolve other words. They called a neighbor who said I had always been sensitive. The prosecutor didn't need more than 2 questions to let the witness float to the top of his own puddle. Closing arguments narrowed the days into a single aisle. The prosecutor didn't raise her voice. She reassembled the spare things chain of custody tags, a bank manager's ordinary caution, the metal taste of methanol, brought into a kitchen as hospitality. "Listen to the tape," she said, and the room did one last time. The verdict did not break the air. It changed the shape of it. Guilty on all counts for Greg. Guilty on murder and conspiracy for Lucas. The judge's voice kept to the old rhythm, the maximum under statute. The possibility of parole measured in decades. Recommendations to a facility with a medical unit, because the record showed an episode for Lucas that had required observation. A mother on the back bench wept out loud. I did not turn to see whose. After the hallway filled with the soft mockery of carpet pretending to quiet what shoes cannot. Ms. Patel touched my arm and said nothing. Colin stood to the side, a man who knew that not every moment asked for language. Sergeant Nolan nodded once as if to mark attendance. Seasons accumulated the way papers do, stacked, rubber-banded, labeled for a future that forgets where it put the label maker. I let the garage breathe. I cleared the bench and left Harold's tools in reach instead of memorial. The neighbors' kids began to bring their parents' aging uprights to my side, door keys that stuck pedals that complained. I learned to listen like Harold listened for a note that lands a hair shy of true, and the turn of a pin that makes it settle. On Saturdays, someone always baked something. I never asked for coffee. The thrift store lost its lease and reopened across town with better light. I went in once and bought a stack of choir scores with penciled notes in a tidy hand. At the bank, Ms. Patel arranged a small evening talk about signatures and proxies. I stood at the end and answered 2 questions and then 3 more. The room smelled like copier paper and peppermint tea. People took their envelopes home and I think opened them. Colin stopped by when he was downtown. Sometimes he left a file without a word for another family who needed someone to keep a line straight. Sometimes he sat on the porch and we didn't talk about work at all. He watered the azalea the week a heat wave came early. The plant lived. The house kept its treaty. The bulbs along the eaves cupped their gold. The cushion in Harold's chair lifted a little and then settled when I stood. In the room that used to be his, I kept a metronome on the dresser. On quiet evenings, I wound it and set it ticking not as a timer for anything, simply as a sound that understood measure. On a Sunday in late autumn, I opened the garage door, and the wind took a page from the workbench and slid it to the floor. It was a list in Harold's hand, Redmond Spinet Buzz on middle D, re-glue hammer felt. The tasks had been crossed out years ago. I put the page back under a tin of graphite and smiled without thinking about who saw. In the living room, the piano that once belonged to the church down the block waited with its lid raised. I sat, pressed a key, and let the single ordinary tone stand in the room until it ended itself. The daylight moved along the wall by inches. A car turned the corner. The porch bulbs would come on soon, same as always. I placed both hands on the keys and played the simplest hymn I knew, not for anybody listening, just to see if the sound still knew how to fill a house. It did. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.